The scream came from the far end of the nursery, and Alara was already moving before she understood why. It was not a scream of pain. It was worse than that. It was the thin, broken cry of a pup who had learned, in the space of one terrible night, that the world could take everything away without warning. 6 pups had been dragged into the Blackthorn Pack's nursery 3 days earlier, their fur still matted with the dust of a border raid that had killed both of their parents in front of them. Since then, none of them had slept for more than a few minutes at a time. None of them had eaten properly. And the smallest of them, a pale gray pup named Fen, had not made a single sound at all until this very moment. Alara dropped to her knees beside him, her heart hammering. "I'm here," she whispered, gathering him against her chest. "I'm here, little one. You're safe." Fen did not stop shaking. His small body trembled the way a leaf trembles in a storm, and his wide amber eyes stared at nothing, fixed on some memory only he could see. The other 5 pups crowded close, pressing their small forms against Alara's legs and arms, as if her presence alone could hold back whatever darkness had followed them here. She had been the nursery's only caretaker for almost a year, ever since old Agnes, the pack healer who had once looked after her, grew too frail to climb the nursery stairs. Nobody else in the Blackthorn Pack wanted the job. It paid nothing. It offered no status. It was the kind of work given to someone with no family name worth protecting, no mate to answer to, no bloodline to speak of. Alara had none of those things. She had been left at the edge of the pack's territory as a small child, wrapped in a plain gray blanket, with no note and no explanation. Agnes had found her, fed her, and given her a place to sleep in exchange for help around the healing house. That was the whole of Alara's history. It fit into a single sentence, and most of the pack had never bothered to learn even that much. But the pups did not care about bloodlines. The pups only cared about warmth and safety and someone who stayed. "Shh," Alara murmured, rocking Fen gently as the others pressed closer. "I know it hurts. I know you're scared, but you don't have to be scared alone." Outside the nursery windows, the night was unusually dark. Clouds hung low over the Blackthorn territory, blotting out the moon that most wolves relied on for comfort and strength. Somewhere beyond the tree line, sentries patrolled the border in tense, watchful silence, because the raid that had orphaned these pups had not been an isolated attack. It had been a warning. A message from a rival pack testing the strength of Blackthorn's defenses, probing for weakness before a larger strike. Alara did not know all of that yet. She only knew that 6 small lives had been placed in her care, and that she intended to keep every one of them safe, even if it meant staying awake until dawn every night for the rest of her life. She hummed a low, wordless tune, the same one Agnes used to hum to her when she was small and frightened and certain that no one wanted her. One by one, the pups began to settle. Fen's shaking slowed, his breathing steadied. The others yawned and blinked, and finally allowed their eyes to close, exhaustion winning out over fear, now that they were surrounded by warmth and a heartbeat they had come to trust. Alara did not notice the moment sleep finally took her too. She simply stopped fighting it, the way a swimmer stops fighting a current that has already carried her too far from shore. Her back rested against the wooden support beam in the center of the nursery floor. Her arms remained curled around Fen. The other 5 pups arranged themselves around and beneath her, small bodies tucked into the folds of her worn blue dress, tails draped over her ankles, noses pressed into the curve of her neck. She had no way of knowing that within the hour, the most powerful and most feared wolf in the entire Northern Territories would walk through that door. Draven Ashgard had not slept properly in 4 days. As Alpha King of the Blackthorn Pack, he carried a weight that few wolves could imagine, and fewer still could survive. He had inherited his throne at the age of 22, when his parents were killed defending their borders from an alliance of hostile packs that believed a young, untested alpha would be easy to overthrow. They had been wrong. Draven had spent the following 6 years proving exactly how wrong they were, conquering 3 rival packs, forging brutal peace where peace refused to exist naturally, and building a reputation so fearsome that most enemies chose retreat over confrontation the moment they learned his name. But reputation did not stop grief. It did not stop the raid 3 nights ago, and it did not stop the 6 small lives left broken in its wake. He had spent the evening in a war council that had lasted far longer than necessary, listening to his generals argue about retaliation, while his cousin Rorik pushed, as he always did, for a swift and merciless response. Draven had ended the meeting without giving an answer either way, which had left the room simmering with unspoken frustration. He needed to think. He needed silence. And more than anything, he needed to see with his own eyes that the pups his soldiers had rescued from the raid were actually being cared for, rather than simply trusting the reports that told him what he wanted to hear. The nursery was tucked into the quietest wing of the Blackthorn stronghold, far from the war rooms and training grounds, in a part of the fortress that Draven rarely had reason to visit. He walked the corridor alone, his boots silent on the stone floor, his wolf restless beneath his skin, in a way it had not been in years. When he pushed open the nursery door, he expected to find a sleeping room, orderly and empty, with pups tucked into their designated cots under the watch of whichever caretaker had been assigned the night shift. He did not expect what he found instead. A young woman sat on the floor in the center of the room, her back against a support beam, fast asleep. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, and fell across her shoulders in soft waves. Her face, even in sleep, carried the faint lines of exhaustion, the kind that came from weeks of worry rather than a single bad night. And around her, beneath her, tangled into the folds of her dress, and pressed against every inch of her that offered warmth, were all 6 of the orphaned pups. Draven stood frozen in the doorway. He had seen those pups only once before, on the night his soldiers carried them in from the border, and even then, the memory had stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. They had been inconsolable, feral with grief. 2 of his most experienced healers had been unable to get near them without triggering a fresh wave of frightened snapping and crying. The youngest, the pale gray one, had not shifted back to his pup form at all in 3 days, remaining locked in his smallest, most vulnerable shape, as though some instinct told him it was safer to stay small and forgettable. And yet here he was, curled directly against the sleeping woman's throat, breathing slow and even, more peaceful than Draven had seen any of them since the raid. Something shifted inside Draven's chest, quiet and unfamiliar. His wolf, Cade, who had been restless and sharp-edged for days, went suddenly and completely still, the way a hunting animal goes still not out of caution, but out of reverence. Draven had felt Cade's judgment many times in his life, that instinctive assessment that ran beneath every conscious thought. He had felt Cade bristle at enemies, growl at threats, sharpen with anticipation before a fight. He had never felt Cade go quiet like this, attentive, almost gentle. Mate. The thought rose up from somewhere ancient and instinctive, so clear and so certain that Draven nearly said it aloud. He dismissed it instantly. He had no time for such notions, and even less patience for the kind of sentimental weakness that made wolves lose themselves over a face glimpsed in low light. He was an alpha king, in the middle of a war. He did not have the luxury of being swept away by a sleeping omega he had never even spoken to. And yet he did not leave. He told himself it was practical concern. The pups were vulnerable. The fortress had already been breached once this season, and it would be irresponsible to leave them unguarded even within pack walls. He told himself that any competent leader would do the same in his position, that this had nothing to do with the strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest as he watched the pale gray pup shift slightly in his sleep, nose burrowing deeper into the curve of the woman's neck. He told himself a great many things that night, standing silent guard by the door until the first gray light of dawn crept through the nursery windows. None of them were entirely true. The pups, he noticed as the hours passed, did not stir once. Not when a distant patrol horn sounded near the border. Not when thunder rumbled somewhere far to the west. Whatever peace they had found, they were not willing to release it easily, and Draven found himself unwilling to be the one who took it from them. He studied the woman's face in the low light. She looked young, though not as young as her position in the pack might suggest. There was a tiredness etched into her features that spoke of years, not months, of being overlooked and overworked. Her clothing was simple and worn at the seams, mended more than once by hands that clearly had no time or resources for anything finer. And yet there was something in the line of her jaw, something in the way even in sleep she kept one arm curved protectively around the smallest pup, that struck Draven as anything but ordinary. He did not know her name. He realized, with a small jolt of something close to shame, that in 6 years of ruling this pack, he had never once had reason to learn it. That would change tonight, he decided, not because his wolf had gone still and reverent in her presence, Not because something in his chest had cracked open for the first time since his parents died, simply because it was his duty, as Alpha King, to know every soul under his protection. He repeated that reasoning to himself several times before dawn, as if repetition alone might make it true. By the time the first pale light touched the nursery floor, 2 of the older pups had begun to stir, blinking sleepily and stretching in the way pups did, unaware or unconcerned that their Alpha King stood only a few paces away, watching over them in silence. One of them, a small brown-furred female, lifted her head, sniffed the air curiously, caught Draven's scent, and let out a soft, curious chuff before settling back down against Alara's side without any sign of fear. That, too, struck Draven as strange. Young pups, especially traumatized ones, were rarely so unbothered by an unfamiliar alpha's presence. Alpha energy could be overwhelming, even to grown wolves, who had trained for years to master their instincts around dominant bloodlines. That the pups barely reacted to him at all suggested something about the environment they had been sleeping in. Something about the woman who held them. A sense of safety so complete that even his presence could not disturb it. He found himself wondering, not for the first time that night, what kind of person could create that kind of safety out of nothing? No pack behind her. No family name, no resources beyond her own 2 hands and whatever patience she carried inside her. And yet 6 grieving, frightened pups had chosen her, instinctively and completely, as the safest place in the entire fortress. The sky outside continued to lighten. Soon the nursery would fill with the sounds of the waking fortress, servants beginning their morning duties, soldiers changing guard along the walls, the low hum of a pack rising to face another day of uncertain peace. Draven knew he should leave before that happened, should return to his own chambers and prepare for the demands the day would place on him. He did not move. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, watching the first light spread slowly across the sleeping form of a woman whose name he did not yet know, and the 6 small lives who had chosen her without hesitation, without doubt, and without a single reason beyond the simple, undeniable truth that she was safe. It was the longest Draven Ashgard had stood still in 6 years, and somewhere beneath his ribs, in a place he had thought long since closed off and hardened beyond feeling, something small and stubborn had already begun, quietly and against every instruction his mind was giving it, to hope. He finally stepped back from the doorway when he heard the first distant clatter of pots from the fortress kitchens, a sound that meant the household would soon be awake and moving through the halls. He did not want to be found standing over a sleeping Omega like some lovesick pup himself, watched and whispered about by servants who would turn the sight into gossip before the sun had fully risen. Whatever this strange stillness was that had settled into his chest, he was not ready to have it dissected by curious eyes. He took one last look at the scene before he left. 6 pups, 1 exhausted young woman who had given every hour of her night, and clearly many nights before it, to soothe creatures that shared no blood with her and offered her nothing in return. He thought of his own childhood, of a mother who had rocked him to sleep during thunderstorms, and a father who had taught him to stand tall, even when his knees shook with fear. And he wondered, with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, what kind of childhood had shaped a woman capable of offering that same comfort to 6 grieving strangers without being asked. He left the nursery without waking her. The corridor outside felt colder than it had before, though nothing about the stone walls or the early morning air had changed. Draven walked back toward his own chambers with his mind circling a single, irritating question. Why had he stayed the entire night? He could have summoned any guard to watch the door. He could have assigned the duty to Rorik, who never slept much anyway, or to one of the junior officers eager to prove their loyalty. Instead, he had stood there himself, hour after hour, simply watching a stranger sleep. He told himself again that it was duty. He told himself it was concern for the pups. By the time he reached his own door, he had almost convinced himself. Almost. The fortress woke slowly around him, the way it always did. Guards changed at the outer wall, their boots striking the stone in familiar rhythm. Servants moved through the kitchens preparing the first meal of the day, and somewhere in the training yard below his window, the clash of practice blades had already begun, steady and unhurried, the sound of wolves preparing for a war that had not yet fully arrived but that everyone could feel gathering at the edges of their territory, like a storm, still too far off to name. Ilara woke slowly, the way she always did after a long night in the nursery. her body stiff from sleeping upright against the support beam. For a moment, she did not open her eyes, simply listened to the small, contented sounds around her, the soft breathing of 6 pups who had finally slept through an entire night without waking in terror. It was the first such night since the raid, and relief washed through her so completely that she nearly wept from it alone. She opened her eyes to find Fen still curled against her throat, his small chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. The other 5 pups were scattered around her in various states of sleep, one draped across her lap, 2 curled together near her hip, one with its nose tucked into the crook of her elbow, and the last stretched along her outstretched leg, as if she were nothing more than a warm patch of sunlight to be claimed. She smiled, despite the ache in her back and the numbness in her legs. Whatever else the day held, this moment felt like a small victory, hard won, and entirely worth the sleepless weeks that had led to it. It was only as she began to gently untangle herself, careful not to wake any of the pups too quickly, that she noticed something odd. The heavy wooden door of the nursery stood slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it fully the night before out of habit, the same habit she followed every single night to keep drafts from reaching the pups. She frowned at it, uncertain, before deciding that perhaps exhaustion had made her careless. She had far more pressing concerns than a door left open by a few inches. Word of the previous night traveled through the fortress far faster than Alara could have anticipated. By the time she had washed her face, changed into a fresh dress, and carried a tray of warm milk and soft bread up to the nursery for the pups' morning meal, at least 3 separate servants had already stopped her in the corridors, with wide eyes and lowered voices, asking whether it was true that the Alpha King himself had been seen standing outside the nursery door in the dead of night. Alara had laughed off the first 2 inquiries, certain they were simply the product of idle gossip, the kind that spread through every pack fortress regardless of how little truth it contained. But by the 3rd, delivered by an older kitchen maid named Hannah who had never once shown interest in nursery matters before, Alara felt a small, uncomfortable knot form in her stomach. "He was seen leaving just after dawn," Hannah said, arranging a stack of clean linens with far more attention than the task required. "Guard Nathaniel said he looked like he hadn't slept at all, standing right outside your door the entire night, apparently. Strange thing for an Alpha King to do, don't you think? Watching over a room full of pups himself, when he's got a whole fortress of soldiers who could do it for him." Alara's hands stilled on the tray she carried. "I'm sure it isn't as unusual as it sounds," she said carefully. "The pups have had a difficult few days. Perhaps he only wanted to be certain they were being looked after properly." Hannah gave her a look that suggested she did not believe that explanation for a single moment, but she said nothing further, only offered a knowing smile before continuing on her way. Alara pushed the conversation from her mind as best she could, though it lingered at the edges of her thoughts throughout the morning, an unwelcome distraction as she fed the pups, cleaned the nursery, and settled the older ones into a quiet game near the window while Fen slept curled in a basket lined with soft wool near her feet. She told herself it did not matter whether the Alpha King had stood outside her door or not. Wolves of his standing rarely concerned themselves with Omegas who cleaned nurseries and mended their own clothing by candlelight. Whatever had brought him to that hallway, it had almost certainly been duty and nothing more, and she would be a fool to imagine otherwise. And yet, despite every sensible thought she offered herself, she found her gaze drifting more than once toward the nursery door throughout the day, half expecting, half dreading, the possibility that it might open again, to reveal the same tall, formidable figure she had glimpsed only in passing over the years, always from a distance, always surrounded by generals and advisors, never once close enough for her to see the color of his eyes. She did not have to wait long to find out. Just past midday, while she was helping the 2 oldest pups practice their first wobbly attempts at shifting back into their human forms, a firm knock sounded at the nursery door, 3 measured strikes that carried an unmistakable authority, even through solid wood. Ilara's heart gave an unsteady lurch. She smoothed her hands over her apron, told the pups to stay seated by the window, and crossed the room to answer it, already half certain, and half terrified, of who she would find standing on the other side. It was him. Draven Ashgard filled the doorway the way storms fill a horizon, not through size alone, though he was tall enough that Alara had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, but through the sheer weight of presence that surrounded him. She had seen him before, always from a careful distance, always surrounded by advisors and soldiers, who seemed to orbit him the way lesser bodies orbit a fixed and unmovable star. She had never once stood this close to him. She had never once had to face the full, undivided attention of those pale gray eyes. "Alpha King," she said, dropping into a quick, correct bow, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't told to expect you." "You weren't meant to expect me," he said. His voice was low, even, giving away nothing. "I came to see the pups." Ilara stepped aside at once, holding the door open wide enough for him to pass. "Of course. They're just there, by the window." Draven stepped into the nursery, and Ilara watched, startled, as the two oldest pups looked up from their play, sniffed the air, and then simply returned to their game, entirely unbothered by the presence of the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, standing only a few paces away. She had expected at least a flicker of nervousness. Most pups, even confident ones, showed some deference or caution around an unfamiliar alpha, especially one whose authority radiated as strongly as Draven's did. Instead, they behaved as though he were simply another familiar face in a room that already felt safe to them. Draven noticed it too. She could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the faint furrow that appeared and vanished across his brow, as he studied the pups, with an intensity that seemed to weigh far more than casual curiosity. "They slept through the night," Ilara offered, when the silence stretched a moment too long. "All 6 of them. It's the first time since the raid." "I know," Draven said. "I was here." Ilara felt heat rise into her cheeks, despite her best effort to remain composed. "So the rumors are true then?" "Rumors travel faster than sense in this fortress," he said, though there was no real irritation in his tone, only a kind of tired acknowledgement. "I came to check on the pups myself, rather than rely on reports. I found you asleep on the floor, buried beneath every one of them, and I saw no reason to disturb what was clearly the first piece they'd found in days." "You could have woken me," Ilara said. "I would have moved, made you more comfortable, brought a chair at the very least." "I didn't need comfort," Draven said. "I needed to see that they were safe. You provided that, far better than any guard I could have posted at the door." There was something almost gruff in the way he said it, as if the admission cost him more than it should have. Ilara found herself studying his face more closely than she probably should have, searching for some sign of the cruelty and coldness that so many whispered stories attributed to him. She found none of it in this moment, only exhaustion, carefully hidden but visible to anyone who knew how to look for it, the same exhaustion she saw reflected in her own face every morning, in the small cracked mirror above her wash basin. "May I ask you something?" Draven said, after a long pause, during which he watched Fen stir slightly in his basket without waking. "Of course. Why do they trust you the way they do? I've seen orphaned pups before. I've seen what grief like theirs does to a young mind. It usually takes weeks, sometimes months, before a pup that traumatized allows anyone new close enough to touch them, let alone sleep against them the way these 6 did with you." Ilara considered the question carefully before answering. It was not the kind of question she was accustomed to being asked, certainly not by someone of Draven's standing, and she found herself uncertain how much of the truth to offer. "I think," she said slowly, "that they can tell when someone isn't going anywhere. Pups that age, especially frightened ones, aren't looking for someone powerful or important. They're looking for someone who will still be there in the morning. I've been the one constant thing in this nursery for almost a year now. Perhaps that's all it is." "That's not nothing," Draven said. "Constancy is rarer than most wolves realize, especially in a place like this." Ilara glanced at him, surprised by the weight in his words, but he had already turned his attention back toward the pups, his expression once again unreadable. She wondered, briefly, what kind of loss had taught him to value constancy so specifically, before reminding herself firmly that it was not her place to wonder such things about her Alpha King. "How long have you cared for the nursery?" Draven asked. "A little under a year," Ilara said. "Before that, I helped Agnes, our old healer, with the general care of the pack's sick and injured. When she grew too frail to manage the nursery stairs, the duty passed to me, since no one else wanted it." "No one else wanted it," Draven repeated, something sharpening in his tone. "It isn't glamorous work, Alpha King," Ilara said, a touch more defensive than she intended. "There's no status in cleaning up after pups or sitting up through the night when one of them has nightmares. Most wolves in this pack have families of their own to care for, or ambitions that don't leave room for unpaid nursery duty. "And you have neither," Draven said. It was not quite a question. "No," Ilara admitted. "I have neither." She expected pity in his expression, or worse, dismissal, the kind of subtle condescension she had grown used to receiving from pack members who considered her position beneath their notice. Instead, Draven studied her for a long moment, with an expression she could not quite name, something between curiosity and quiet respect. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "I realized this morning that I did not know it, and I found that unacceptable for someone under my protection." "Ilara," she said. "Just Ilara. I was found at the border as a child, with no family name to give." "Ilara," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "Well, Ilara, you've done something in the space of one night that my best healers could not accomplish in 3 days. That deserves recognition, whether or not you consider your work glamorous." Before Ilara could formulate a response, a small, hesitant sound drew both their attention toward the basket by the window. Fen had woken, blinking sleepily up at the unfamiliar tall figure standing near his basket, and rather than the fear Ilara half expected, the small pup let out a soft, curious chuff and began to wriggle his way out of the basket, moving with clear determination toward Draven's boots. "Fen, wait," Ilara said quickly, moving to intercept him, uncertain how the Alpha King would react to being approached so boldly by a grieving pup he barely knew. But Draven crouched down before she could reach them, lowering himself to the pup's level, with a patience that seemed entirely at odds with the fierce reputation that preceded him everywhere he went. Fen stopped just short of his outstretched hand, sniffed cautiously, and then, to Ilara's astonishment, pressed his small head directly against Draven's palm. Something shifted across Draven's face in that moment, something raw and unguarded that Ilara suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. He remained crouched there for a long moment, his large hand resting gently against the small pup's head, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier composure. "This one hasn't shifted back since the raid," he said quietly. It was not a question. "No," Ilara said. "He hasn't spoken either, not in his pup form or otherwise. I think he's afraid that if he becomes himself again, it will make what happened to his parents feel real, in a way he isn't ready for." Draven said nothing for a long moment, simply continuing to hold his hand steady beneath Fen's small chin. "I understand that feeling better than I'd like to admit," he said finally. Ilara did not ask what he meant. Something in his tone told her the question would not be welcome, and something in the careful, guarded way he straightened afterward, putting a measured distance back between himself and the moment of unexpected vulnerability, confirmed that whatever door had briefly opened was already closing again. "I'll have additional supplies sent up for the nursery," Draven said, his voice returning to its earlier formal tone. "Blankets, food, whatever you require to care for them properly. You need only ask the household steward." "Thank you, Alpha King," Ilara said, though something in her chest ached faintly at the sudden return to distance and formality. He paused at the door before leaving, glancing back at her with an expression she could not fully decipher. "I may return to check on their progress," he said. "If that is acceptable to you." "Of course," Ilara said, startled that he would think to ask her permission at all. "It's your nursery, Alpha King, your pack. You need no permission from me." "Perhaps not," Draven said, "but I find myself inclined to ask regardless." And with that, he was gone, leaving Ilara standing in the doorway with her pulse racing and an entirely new set of questions crowding into a mind that had, until that morning, been occupied solely with the practical demands of caring for 6 grieving pups. She did not yet understand what had shifted in that room. She only knew, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that something had. The following days brought Draven back to the nursery more often than either of them openly acknowledged. He arrived at unpredictable hours, sometimes early in the morning before the fortress had fully woken, sometimes late in the evening after long war councils had left him visibly drained. He rarely stayed long, and he rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but each visit chipped away, slowly and almost imperceptibly, at the wall of formal distance that had defined their first conversation. Ilara found herself, despite every attempt to remain professionally detached, beginning to notice small things about him that she had no right to notice. The way his shoulders relaxed by a fraction whenever Fen approached him without hesitation. The way his voice softened, almost involuntarily, when he addressed the youngest pups. The particular crease that formed between his brows whenever something troubled him deeply enough that he could not fully hide it, even behind the carefully constructed mask he wore for the rest of his pack. She told herself repeatedly that these observations meant nothing. That noticing such details about her alpha king was simply a natural consequence of proximity. Nothing more significant than the familiarity anyone might develop toward a person they encountered regularly. She was, after all, nothing more than the nursery caretaker, an omega with no name worth mentioning, and no claim to anyone's attention beyond the practical matter of the pups she cared for. And yet, late at night, after the pups had finally settled and the fortress had grown quiet around her, she found her thoughts drifting, unbidden and unwelcome, toward pale gray eyes, and a hand resting gently against a small pup's head, and a voice that had said, with quiet and unmistakable sincerity, that he found himself inclined to ask her permission regardless. She did not yet know what that meant. She only knew that whatever careful, ordinary life she had built for herself in the shadows of the Blackthorn pack was beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to change. 10 days after the raid, Fen shifted for the first time. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that gave no warning of the significance it would come to hold. Elara had been sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor, helping the two older pups practice a simple counting game with smooth painted stones, while Fen dozed nearby in his basket, still preferring his smallest and safest shape, even as the days passed, and his siblings slowly began returning to their more playful selves. Draven had arrived unannounced, as had become his habit, slipping into the nursery during a rare gap between council meetings. He settled onto the low bench near the window without ceremony, watching the pups at their game with the same quiet attentiveness he always brought to these visits, and Elara had grown accustomed enough to his presence by now that she no longer felt the need to interrupt her work whenever he appeared. It was Draven who noticed first. A soft, low sound came from the basket, not quite a whimper, not quite a growl, but something in between, something that carried none of the fear that had colored every sound Fen made since the raid. Elara turned just in time to see the small gray pup's outline begin to shimmer and shift, bones rearranging themselves with the swift, practiced ease that came naturally to wolves who had done this 1,000 times before, though for Fen, at not quite 4 years old, this would only be his second or third experience of the change. Within moments, where the pup had been curled in the basket, a small boy now lay instead, blinking up at the ceiling with wide, startled eyes, his dark hair mussed from sleep, his little chest rising and falling with the effort of adjusting to a form he had avoided for over a week. "Fen," Elara breathed, scrambling across the floor to kneel beside the basket. "Oh, Fen, look at you." The boy's lower lip trembled, and for one terrible moment, Elara feared he was about to dissolve into the kind of inconsolable grief that had marked his first days in the nursery. Instead, he reached up with both small hands and wrapped them around her neck, burying his face against her shoulder with a shuddering breath that was, unmistakably, the sound of a child finally allowing himself to feel safe enough to cry properly, for the first time since his world had been shattered. Elara held him and let him cry, rocking gently, murmuring soft reassurances into his hair, entirely unaware of how closely Draven watched the scene from his place on the bench, his own throat tight with an emotion he had not expected to feel so sharply. He remembered, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, his own mother's arms around him on the night his grandfather had died, the first real loss he had ever experienced as a child. He remembered how she had let him cry without once telling him to be strong, without once reminding him that an alpha's heir could not afford such open displays of weakness. That patience, that unconditional gentleness, was something Draven had not experienced from anyone since the day both his parents were taken from him in a single violent afternoon that had ended his own childhood far too early. Watching Elara offer that same unconditional gentleness to a boy who had no claim on her beyond simple need, Draven felt something inside his chest give way entirely, a wall he had built so long ago that he had forgotten it was possible to feel its absence. "He'll be all right," Elara said softly, once Fen's tears had slowed to hiccuping breaths. "Won't you, little one? You're safe here. You're going to be all right." Fen lifted his tear-streaked face just enough to glance toward Draven, and to everyone's surprise, including his own apparently, he extended one small hand toward the Alpha King, an unmistakable invitation. Draven crossed the room without hesitation and knelt beside them, allowing the boy to grip two of his fingers, with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small hand. "You did well," Draven said, his voice rough, in a way Alara had not heard before. "Shifting back takes more courage than most people understand. You should be proud." Fen said nothing, not yet ready to speak, but he did not let go of Draven's fingers either, and the three of them remained there together on the nursery floor for a long while, until the boy's eyes grew heavy again, and he drifted into the first truly peaceful sleep he had known since the raid, still holding tightly to both of the people who had chosen, without needing to be asked, to become his safety. It was in the quiet aftermath of that moment, once Fen had been settled properly into a small cot near the window, that Draven finally asked the question that had been building in him for days. "Tell me about your childhood," he said. "The parts before Agnes found you, if you remember any of it, and the parts after, if you're willing to share them." Alara considered deflecting the question, as she usually did, when curious pack members pried into her history, out of idle interest, rather than genuine concern. But something about the quiet sincerity in Draven's tone, and the vulnerability he had just displayed in front of her without apparent shame, made her decide, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to answer honestly. "I don't remember anything before Agnes," she admitted. "I was perhaps 2 or 3 years old when she found me at the border, wrapped in a plain gray blanket with no note, no mark, nothing to indicate who my parents were, or why they left me there. She always said I didn't cry when she found me, just watched her with wide eyes, as though I'd already learned that crying didn't bring anyone back." Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "Agnes raised me the best she could, though she was already older by the time she took me in, and she had her healing duties to attend to besides. I grew up mostly in the healing house, learning how to identify herbs and set bones and stitch wounds before I learned much of anything else. There wasn't much room in that life for the kind of things other pups took for granted. Games, friends my own age, a sense that I belonged somewhere simply because of who I was, rather than what I could offer in return. That's not childhood," Draven said quietly. "That's survival." "Perhaps," Alara said, "but it taught me things that turned out to matter. How to sit with someone in pain without flinching away from it. How to recognize fear in a creature too young or too frightened to name it themselves. When Agnes grew too frail for the nursery stairs and the duty passed to me, I understood almost immediately why no one else wanted it. It isn't easy work, watching over grief that isn't your own, night after night, with no promise that anything you do will ever be enough to fix what's broken. And yet you stayed," Draven said. "Where else would I go?" Alara said, with a small, humorless laugh. "I have no pack beyond this one. No family name to carry me somewhere better. The nursery was the one place in this fortress where I felt like I had a purpose worth keeping." Draven was quiet for a long moment, watching Fen's small chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep. "You deserve more than a purpose built on the absence of other options," he said finally. Alara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, and the silence between them stretched, not uncomfortably, but heavy, with things neither of them was yet prepared to name. It was Rorik, Draven's cousin and closest advisor, who broke the quiet spell that had begun to settle over the fortress in those following weeks. Rorik had never much cared for sentiment, viewing it as a weakness that clever wolves exploited in their rivals whenever the opportunity presented itself. He had watched Draven's growing preoccupation with the nursery with increasing unease, first dismissing it as simple concern for the pack's most vulnerable members. Then, as the visits grew more frequent and the rumors more persistent, recognizing it for what it actually was. "You cannot be serious," Rorik said one evening, catching Draven alone in the war room, after the rest of the council had departed. "An Omega, with no name, no bloodline, no connections of any value, and you're spending your evenings sitting on nursery floors like some love-struck pup yourself." "I go to check on the children," Draven said evenly, though there was a warning edge beneath the words that Rorik, wisely, chose to acknowledge, with a slight pause before continuing. "The children are being cared for," Rorik said. "That much is obvious to everyone in this fortress. What concerns me, cousin, is the growing talk of your particular attention toward their caretaker. You are the Alpha King. Every alliance we build, every treaty we negotiate, depends on the strength of your position, and that position depends, in no small part, on the strength of the mate you eventually choose. A nameless nursery maid offers this pack nothing. No bloodline to secure loyalty from neighboring territories. No dowry of land or resources to strengthen our standing. Nothing beyond whatever soft comfort she provides to grieving pups. She provided more comfort in a single night than our best healers managed in 3 days, Draven said, his voice low and controlled, though something dangerous simmered just beneath the surface of it. I don't doubt her skill with children, Rorik said. But skill with children does not make her suitable to stand beside a king. Think of what our enemies would say. Think of what it would signal to every pack watching for the first sign of weakness in your leadership. If word spread that the great Alpha King had lost his head over an unclaimed Omega, with no lineage worth mentioning. Draven said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the map spread across the war table, tracing the borders of territories he had spent 6 years defending and expanding, thinking of every sacrifice that position had already demanded of him. There is nothing between us that requires your concern, he said finally, though even as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of their falseness settle uncomfortably in his chest. I visit the nursery out of duty to the pups, nothing more. Rorik studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but he did not press further, simply inclining his head in the manner of a man who intended to keep a careful watch on a matter he considered far from settled. See that it remains nothing more, cousin, Rorik said as he departed, for both your sake and hers. Left alone in the war room, Draven remained staring at the map for a long while, his thoughts far from the borders and territories spread before him. He told himself that Rorik's concerns were nothing more than the usual political caution any advisor might offer, a reasonable warning, grounded in reasonable logic. He told himself that his visits to the nursery truly were nothing more than duty, that whatever strange warmth had settled into his chest since the night he found Alara asleep beneath a pile of orphaned pups, meant nothing beyond simple gratitude for her care of his people's most vulnerable members. He told himself a great many things that evening, standing alone in the quiet war room with the weight of an entire kingdom's expectations pressing down upon him. None of them made the warmth in his chest disappear. By the following month, it had become impossible to ignore what everyone in the fortress could plainly see. The 6 orphaned pups, once so fragile that even a raised voice could send them into fits of trembling fear, had transformed into something closer to their old selves, playful, curious, and increasingly bold. They had also, in that same span of time, become utterly and completely devoted to Alara, in a way that extended far beyond the walls of the nursery. They followed her to the kitchens when she collected their morning meals, trotting along at her heels in a small, determined line that never failed to draw amused glances from the fortress staff. They followed her to the healing house when she visited Agnes, curling up together in a warm pile beside the old healer's chair, while Alara helped change dressings and prepare remedies. They even followed her, on more than one occasion, to the edge of the training yard, where soldiers had learned to expect the sight of 6 small pups pressing their noses against the fence, watching Alara, with the same devoted attention, most wolves reserved only for their own mothers. Fen, in particular, had become nearly inseparable from her. He had continued shifting more regularly since that first breakthrough, though he still preferred to sleep in his smaller form most nights, and he rarely allowed more than a few feet of distance to separate himself from Alara at any given hour of the day. The other pack members had begun referring to the group, half fondly and half in bewilderment, as Alara's shadow pack, a nickname that made Alara blush every time she overheard it, though she could not deny its accuracy. Draven's visits to the nursery had not slowed either, though he had grown more careful about the timing and frequency of them, mindful of Rorik's warning, even as he found himself increasingly unable to heed it. He told himself each time that this visit would be the last unnecessary one, that from now on he would rely on official reports rather than personal observation, and each time he found some new excuse, some fresh justification, that brought him back through that particular door before the week was through. It was during one such visit, on a gray afternoon when rain drummed steadily against the nursery windows, that Draven found himself watching Alara teach the 2 oldest pups a simple song, her voice soft and slightly off-key, in a way that made the moment feel more intimate than any perfectly executed performance could have managed. Fen sat curled against her side, half asleep, one small hand fisted loosely in the fabric of her sleeve, and the remaining 3 pups tumbled and wrestled nearby in the harmless, exuberant way of young wolves, who had finally remembered how to simply be pups again. "You've done something remarkable here," Draven said, when the song ended and the pups scattered to resume their play. "I've seen grief consume entire packs for years. You've helped 6 children move through the worst of theirs in a matter of weeks." "They did the hard part themselves," Alara said, though the praise clearly warmed something in her, visible in the slight flush that rose to her cheeks. "I only gave them somewhere safe to do it." "That is no small thing," Draven said. "Safety isn't as easily given as most wolves assume. It has to be earned, moment by moment, through consistency that never wavers. You've given them that, every single day since the raid, without complaint, without reward, without anyone even bothering to notice until now." Alara glanced at him, surprised by the intensity behind his words. "You noticed," she said quietly. "I noticed the very first night," Draven said. "I haven't stopped noticing since." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them had perhaps intended, and for a moment, neither seemed to know quite what to say next. It was Fen who broke the silence, wriggling free of Alara's side to make his slow, determined way across the floor toward Draven, arms outstretched in the universal demand of a small child wanting to be lifted. Draven obliged without hesitation, settling the boy against his hip with a practiced ease that suggested this had become a familiar routine between them, whatever formal distance he tried to maintain in every other aspect of his life. Fen immediately relaxed against him, thumb finding its way into his mouth, dark eyes drooping toward sleep despite the early hour. "He trusts you completely," Alara observed, watching the two of them with an expression Draven could not quite read. "He trusts easily, for a pup who's lost so much," Draven said. "That's your doing, not mine. You taught him it was safe to trust again before I ever set foot in this room." "Perhaps," Alara said, "but he chose you on his own." "I never taught him that." Draven had no answer for that, and the silence that followed felt different from their earlier ones, softer somehow, less burdened by the careful formality both of them usually worked so hard to maintain. It did not take long for word of these increasingly frequent, increasingly personal visits to reach the Pack Council, and it took even less time for Rorik to bring the matter before the full assembly, framing his concerns not as jealousy or personal disapproval, but as a matter of pack security and political necessity. "Our Alpha King spends more hours in the nursery these days than in the war room," Rorik announced during a council meeting that Draven had been unable to avoid, his tone carefully measured to sound like reasonable concern rather than calculated attack. "I do not question his devotion to the pups under his protection. I question the wisdom of allowing rumors to spread unchecked, rumors that suggest an attachment forming between our king and an omega of no lineage, no bloodline, and no political value whatsoever." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members, some sympathetic to Rorik's concerns, others clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the accusation. Draven sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, giving away nothing of the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. "The pack's enemies grow bolder by the season," Rorik continued, pressing his advantage. "The raid on our border was no isolated incident. It was a test, and if our enemies sense weakness in our leadership, sentiment where they expect strength, they will not hesitate to exploit it. A king distracted by matters of the heart is a king vulnerable to attack. I say this not out of disrespect for the young woman in question, but out of concern for the survival of everything this pack has built." The room fell silent, waiting for Draven's response. He was aware, in that moment, of the careful attention every member of the council was paying to his reaction, aware that whatever he said next would shape the political reality of his position for weeks or months to come. "There is no attachment that threatens this pack's security," Draven said finally, his voice flat and controlled. "I visit the nursery to ensure the welfare of children under my protection, nothing more. If my presence there has been misinterpreted by idle gossip, that reflects poorly on the discipline of this household's staff, not on any failing in my leadership." It was, he knew even as he said it, a careful and deliberate lie, the kind of lie a king told when political necessity outweighed personal truth. He watched Rorik's expression carefully, saw the flicker of satisfaction that crossed his cousin's face, and felt something cold settle into his stomach, despite the tactical soundness of his own denial. He did not know, in that moment, that Alara had been standing just outside the council chamber, having been sent to deliver a message regarding the pup's need for additional winter blankets, and that she had heard every word of his public dismissal through the heavy wooden door. She did not cry, standing there in the corridor with the message still clutched in her hand. She had learned long ago, in a childhood built more on survival than sentiment, that tears rarely changed anything, and that the wisest response to disappointment was simply to absorb it quietly and continue forward with whatever tasks remained before her. But something in her chest ached with a sharpness she had not expected, a foolish, undignified hope she had allowed herself to nurture, despite every rational reason not to, now extinguished as thoroughly as a candle pinched between two careful fingers. She delivered her message to a passing steward instead of entering the council chamber herself, then returned to the nursery, where 6 pups waited for her, with the unconditional devotion that required no bloodline, no political calculation, and no careful denial spoken behind closed doors. Whatever the Alpha King believed about the nature of his visits, Elara resolved that evening, as she settled the pups for the night, and felt Fenn's small hand find hers in the darkness, she would not allow herself to be foolish enough to hope for anything more than what she already had. A purpose, a place, however small, in this fortress, and 6 small souls who needed her exactly as she was, without requiring her to be anything more. It was enough, she told herself, over and over, until the words nearly began to feel true. The days following the council meeting settled into a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. Draven did not stop visiting the nursery entirely, but his visits grew shorter, more formal, more carefully bracketed by the presence of guards or attendants who ensured no further rumors could take root from unwitnessed moments. Elara noticed the change immediately, though she said nothing about it, matching his new distance with a polite, professional composure of her own that gave away none of the quiet hurt she carried beneath it. She told herself this was for the best. A king had responsibilities that extended far beyond the walls of a single nursery, and whatever brief warmth had passed between them during those quieter weeks had likely meant more to her than it ever had to him. She had been foolish to imagine otherwise, foolish to let herself believe that a nameless orphan, with no bloodline, could ever occupy a meaningful place in the life of someone destined to rule an entire territory. And yet, despite her best efforts to accept this new reality, the ache remained, quiet and persistent, tucked into the corners of her days like a splinter, too small to remove, but too deep to ignore entirely. Rorik, for his part, seemed satisfied with the outcome of the council meeting, and made increasingly little effort to disguise his continued interest in ensuring the matter stayed settled. He began appearing near the nursery with unusual frequency himself, always under some official pretext, always watching Elara with a careful, assessing gaze that made her distinctly uncomfortable, though she could never quite identify a specific reason to voice a complaint. "You've done well with the pups," Rorik said one afternoon, catching her alone in the corridor outside the nursery, while the children napped inside. "Better than expected, given your background." "Thank you," Elara said carefully, sensing correctly that the compliment carried an edge she had not yet identified. "It would be a shame," Rorik continued, his tone light but his eyes sharp, "if idle gossip about your closeness to our Alpha King were to distract from that good work. Reputations are fragile things, especially for those without family or standing to protect them. I would hate to see yours suffer for rumors that, I'm certain, hold no truth whatsoever." The threat, thinly veiled beneath courteous phrasing, was unmistakable. Elara held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him see how thoroughly his words had landed. "I have never sought anything beyond my duty to these children," she said. "I would ask that, whatever rumors trouble you, be addressed with those who spread them, rather than with me." Something flickered across Rorik's face. Brief irritation, quickly smoothed away beneath practiced calm. "Of course," he said. "I only mean to offer friendly counsel. This fortress can be an unforgiving place for those who forget their position within it." He left without further comment, and Elara remained standing in the corridor for a long moment afterward, her heart pounding, with a mixture of anger and fear she had rarely allowed herself to feel so openly. She had no family to protect her, no pack loyalty beyond her own unpaid dedication to a nursery duty most of the pack considered beneath their notice. If Rorik decided to make her life difficult, there would be little standing between his ambitions and her continued place within these walls. She did not mention the encounter to Draven when he visited that evening, arriving later than usual, his expression carrying the particular weariness of someone who had spent the day navigating conversations he found distasteful. "The pups seem well," he observed, watching Fen chase one of his siblings around the low table in the center of the room, both of them shrieking with the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that had once seemed impossible for these particular children. "They are," Elara said simply. Draven glanced at her, perhaps sensing the careful reserve in her tone, though he did not press the matter, settling instead onto the bench near the window to watch the pups at their play. The silence between them stretched longer than usual, no longer comfortable in the way it had once been, weighted instead with things unspoken on both sides. "I heard about the council meeting," Elara said finally, unable to hold the words back any longer, though she kept her eyes fixed on the pups rather than meeting his gaze directly. "I was in the corridor when you spoke to them about your visits here." Draven's expression shifted, something like guilt flickering briefly across his features before he schooled it back into careful neutrality. "Elara, you don't owe me an explanation," she said quickly, before he could continue. "You're the Alpha King. Whatever you say to your council is your own business, and it was foolish of me to expect anything different from what you said." "It was necessary," Draven said, though even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow to his own ears. "Rorik was building a case that threatened the stability of my position. A denial was the only reasonable response, politically." "I understand," Elara said, and the terrible thing was, she truly did understand, even as understanding did nothing to soften the ache in her chest. "You don't need to justify it to me. I was never anything more than the nursery caretaker in the eyes of this pack, and it was foolish of me to imagine that had changed, simply because you found time to visit occasionally." "That isn't true," Draven said, his voice sharper than he intended, drawing the attention of the pups nearby, who paused their play to glance curiously between the two adults. "Isn't it?" Elara said quietly. "You said, in front of your entire council, that there was no attachment here worth mentioning. That your visits meant nothing beyond duty. I believe you, Alpha King, because I have no reason not to, but please don't ask me to pretend it didn't sting to hear it." Draven fell silent, unable to offer a response that would not reveal more than he was prepared to admit, even to himself. He watched Elara gather Fen into her arms as the boy toddled over, sensing the tension in the room without understanding its cause, and something in his chest tightened painfully at the sight of her holding the child with the same unconditional warmth she had always shown, even now, even after everything. "I should return to my duties," Draven said finally, rising from the bench. "Thank you, as always, for your care of the pups." "Of course, Alpha King," Elara said, her voice carefully polite, carefully distant, a mirror of the formality he himself had constructed between them. He left without further words, and Elara stood in the center of the nursery for a long while, after the door closed behind him, holding Fen against her chest, feeling the small, steady rhythm of the boy's heartbeat against her own, and wondering, not for the first time, whether she had made a terrible mistake in allowing herself to care for someone so far beyond her reach. That night, alone in her small quarters after the pups had finally settled into sleep, Elara allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to cry. She cried not for herself exactly, but for the foolish, fragile hope she had carried without fully acknowledging it, the quiet imagining of a life in which someone like Draven Ashgard might have looked at someone like her, and seen not a nameless orphan, or a convenient caretaker, but someone worth choosing, openly and without hesitation, regardless of what his council or his kingdom demanded of him. She understood, with painful clarity, that such hope had never been realistic. Kings did not choose Omegas with no bloodline. Alliances were built on land and lineage, not on shared quiet moments over a sleeping pup's basket. She had known this from the very beginning, and yet somehow, despite knowing it, she had allowed herself to hope anyway. She resolved, wiping her eyes and steadying her breathing, that she would not make that mistake again. She would continue her duties in the nursery with the same dedication she always had, would continue caring for the pups who needed her, exactly as they always had. But she would guard her heart more carefully from now on, would not allow herself to read meaning into quiet moments or gentle words that clearly meant far less to him than they had come to mean to her. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that across the fortress, in his own quarters, Draven Ashgard sat awake long into the night, staring at nothing, his wolf restless and furious beneath his skin, howling silently against a lie he had spoken, not because he believed it, but because he had not yet found the courage to face what speaking the truth would actually cost him. Neither of them slept well that night, and neither of them, in the days that followed, found the words to bridge the distance that Draven's careful denial had carved between them, a distance that would remain, quiet and unresolved, until circumstances far more dangerous than gossip or political maneuvering forced everything into the open at last. The attack came on a night with no moon at all, the kind of darkness wolves feared instinctively, when their connection to the sky above felt weakest and their vulnerability felt strongest. Ilara woke to the sound of shattering glass somewhere in the lower levels of the fortress, followed almost immediately by the distant, unmistakable clash of steel, and the sharp, panicked cries of a household caught entirely off guard. Her heart lurched into her throat as she scrambled upright, instinct driving her toward the 6 small beds arranged around the nursery, before conscious thought had fully caught up with her racing pulse. "Wake up," she said urgently, moving quickly between the pups, gathering the youngest ones into her arms, even as the older 2 blinked awake in groggy confusion. "We need to move now." The pups, sensing the fear in her voice, responded with immediate obedience, none of the usual sleepy resistance that accompanied being woken in the middle of the night. Fen clung to her side the moment his feet touched the floor, his small body already trembling with a fear that clearly recalled, with terrible clarity, the raid that had taken his parents. Ilara had prepared for exactly this possibility months ago, in the quiet hours after the first raid, when she had realized that the nursery's location within the fortress offered little natural protection against a determined attack. She had identified a small, hidden storage den behind a false wall in the nursery's rear corner, originally built as an emergency shelter during the fortress's construction decades earlier, and she had quietly stocked it with blankets, water, and dried food, never speaking of the preparation to anyone, uncertain whether such caution would ever prove necessary. Tonight, it did. "In here," she said, pressing against the hidden panel until it swung open, revealing the narrow, dark space beyond. She ushered the pups inside quickly, counting each small body as they scrambled through the opening, her hands shaking despite her outward composure. "Stay quiet, all of you. No matter what you hear, stay hidden and stay quiet until I come back for you." Fen refused to release his grip on her sleeve, his wide eyes filled with the same raw terror she had first seen the night his parents were killed. "I have to make sure the door holds," Ilara told him gently, prying his small fingers loose as carefully as she could manage. "I promise I'll be right back. I need you to be brave for your brothers and sisters, just a little longer." It took every ounce of willpower she possessed to close the panel on his frightened face, sealing the 6 pups into the darkness of the hidden den, while the sounds of violence grew steadily louder, somewhere beyond the nursery walls. She dragged the heaviest piece of furniture she could manage across the room to block the main door, then positioned herself near the false wall, gripping the iron fire poker from the small hearth as her only available weapon, prepared to defend the space with whatever strength she possessed. She did not have to wait long. The main door burst open moments later, the furniture barricade doing little to slow the intruder who forced his way through with brutal efficiency. He was a large wolf shifted only partially into a hybrid form, clearly one of the raiding party that had struck the border months earlier, now pressing deeper into Blackthorn territory, with the fortress's defenses stretched thin by a coordinated attack on multiple fronts. "Where are the pups?" the intruder demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl, eyes sweeping the room with cold, calculating purpose. "The sable line ends tonight, one way or another." Ilara had no idea what he meant by those words, no understanding of what significance the pups could hold beyond their simple existence as orphaned children, but she understood with absolute clarity that whatever his purpose, she would not allow him to reach the hidden den behind her. "There's nothing here for you," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Leave now, while you still can." The intruder's response was a short, humorless laugh, before he lunged toward her, and Ilara reacted with the only weapon available to her, swinging the iron poker with every ounce of strength her frame possessed. The blow connected with his shoulder, staggering him just enough to buy her precious seconds, though the fire in his eyes only sharpened with fury rather than retreating in caution. She fought with a desperation born of pure necessity, striking again and again as he pressed forward, taking a glancing blow across her ribs that stole the breath from her lungs and sent sharp pain radiating through her side. She stumbled but did not fall, planting herself firmly between the intruder and the false wall behind which 6 children waited in terrified silence, and she raised the poker once more, prepared to keep fighting for as long as her body allowed. It was in that moment, as the intruder gathered himself for what would clearly be a final, decisive strike, that the nursery door was torn from its remaining hinges entirely, and Draven Ashgard entered the room with a fury that seemed to shake the very stones of the fortress around him. He crossed the distance between the doorway and the intruder in a single, powerful motion, driving the man back with a force that sent him crashing into the far wall hard enough to crack the plaster. Whatever followed happened too quickly for Alara to fully track through the haze of pain and adrenaline clouding her vision, a blur of movement and controlled violence that ended, within moments, with the intruder subdued and unmoving on the nursery floor, no longer a threat to anyone. Draven turned toward her immediately, his expression shifting from cold fury to raw, unguarded fear, the instant he registered the blood staining her side where the intruder's blow had landed. "Alara," he said, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands hovering uncertainly over her injured side, as though afraid that touching her might cause further harm. "You're hurt." "The pups," she managed, waving off his concern with a shaking hand. "Behind the false wall. They're safe. They're hidden. But I need to get to them." Draven helped her across the room, supporting her weight without hesitation, as she guided him to the hidden panel, pulling it open to reveal 6 small, terrified faces, staring up at them from the darkness within. The moment they recognized Alara, despite the blood and the visible pain etched across her face, the pups scrambled forward, and Fen, in particular, launched himself directly into her arms, with a force that made her wince, though she did not release him, holding him close despite the protest of her injured ribs. "You're safe now," she murmured into his hair, tears finally slipping free as the full weight of what had nearly happened settled over her. "You're all safe now." Draven knelt beside them, gathering 2 of the smaller pups against himself, as they too pressed forward, seeking comfort and reassurance after the terror of the past several minutes. For a long moment, none of them spoke, simply existing together in the wreckage of the nursery, grateful beyond words that the worst outcome had been avoided. It was only once the immediate danger had passed, once additional guards had arrived to secure the room and carry the subdued intruder away for questioning, that Draven finally allowed himself to look properly at Alara's injury, his expression darkening with barely controlled fury at the sight of the blood soaking through her nightclothes. "This needs proper attention," he said, his voice tight. "Now." "The pups first," Alara insisted, though her voice had grown noticeably weaker, the adrenaline that had carried her through the fight beginning to fade and leave raw pain in its place. "Make sure they're settled somewhere safe before you worry about me." "They will be settled the moment I know you are not bleeding to death in front of me," Draven said, and there was no room for argument in his tone, no trace of the careful political distance he had maintained in recent weeks. In that moment, watching her sway slightly on her feet, her face growing paler by the second, he looked at her with an intensity that held nothing back at all. He lifted her carefully into his arms, despite her weak protest, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the violence he had just delivered to her attacker only moments before, and carried her toward the healing house himself, leaving instructions with the arriving guards to see the pups safely settled in a secure chamber near his own quarters until the fortress's defenses could be fully assessed. Alara drifted in and out of clear awareness during the walk, the pain in her side sharpening with every step, but she remained conscious enough to notice the way Draven held her, close against his chest, his jaw set with fierce, protective determination, his heartbeat pounding rapidly beneath her ear, in a rhythm that spoke of fear far deeper than simple duty could explain. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did that man say the Sable line ends tonight? What did he mean?" Draven's expression tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer, too consumed by worry over her injury to address the question at all. But he glanced down at her, something unreadable passing behind his pale gray eyes, and said, quietly, almost to himself as much as to her, "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Whatever answer that question eventually revealed, Alara sensed, with the last clear thought before pain and exhaustion finally pulled her under, that it would change everything she thought she understood about who she truly was. Alara woke slowly, the sharp pain in her side dulled to a distant throb by whatever remedies the healers had administered while she slept. The room around her was unfamiliar, richer and more spacious than her own small quarters near the nursery, with heavy curtains drawn against the morning light, and a fire burning steadily in a hearth carved with an emblem she recognized as belonging to the Blackthorn royal family. She was, she realized with a jolt of surprise, in a chamber within Draven's own private wing of the fortress. "You're awake." Draven's voice came from a chair positioned near the bed, and Alara turned her head to find him sitting there, still dressed in the same clothes from the previous night, dark circles evident beneath his eyes that suggested he had not slept at all. "How long have you been there?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Since I carried you here," he said simply. "The healers wanted you monitored closely through the night. I saw no reason to trust that duty to anyone else." Alara struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull of bandages wrapped tightly around her ribs. "The pups," she said immediately. "Are they safe?" Draven assured her quickly. "All 6 of them, settled in a chamber just down the hall, watched over by 2 of my most trusted guards. Fen has asked for you at least a dozen times since dawn. I told him you needed rest, but I doubt that answer will satisfy him much longer." Relief washed through Alara so completely that she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, embarrassed by how easily emotions seemed to surface after the previous night's terror. "Thank you," she said, "for coming when you did, for carrying me here yourself, rather than leaving it to someone else. There was no version of last night in which I would have left you to anyone else's care," Draven said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that made Alara's breath catch slightly. Before she could formulate a response to that, Draven's expression shifted, something more serious settling over his features as he leaned forward slightly in his chair. "There's something I need to ask you about," he said, "something the healer noticed while treating your injury." "What is it?" "May I see your shoulder?" "The left one, just beneath the collarbone." Confused but compliant, Alara shifted the loose fabric of her sleeping gown enough to reveal the small mark she had carried her entire life, a pale, star-shaped birthmark that had never held any particular significance to her beyond being an unremarkable feature of her own skin. Draven's reaction told her immediately that it held significance to him. He went very still, his eyes fixed on the mark with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "Do you know what that is?" "A birthmark," Alara said, bewildered by his reaction. "I've had it since Agnes found me. She always said it was nothing more than an unusual pattern of pigment, nothing significant." "It is the mark of House Sable," Draven said, and the name landed in the quiet room, with the weight of something momentous. "A royal bloodline that ruled the Eastern Territories generations ago, before their entire kingdom was destroyed in a war that also claimed my own parents' closest allies. It was believed that every member of that bloodline died in the final siege, the line extinguished entirely, their territory divided among the surviving packs who fought in that war." Alara stared at him, struggling to process what he was suggesting. "You think I think," Draven said carefully, "that you may be the last living heir of a bloodline everyone believed had been completely destroyed 30 years ago. I think the man who attacked the nursery last night knew, or at least suspected, exactly who you are, and that the words he spoke about the Sable line ending were not idle threats, but a targeted attempt to eliminate a bloodline that some still consider dangerous, even after all these years." The implications settled over Alara like a physical weight, each one more disorienting than the last. She was not, as she had believed her entire life, a nameless orphan, with no history worth mentioning. She carried, whether she wanted it or not, the blood of a royal line that had once ruled an entire kingdom, a kingdom destroyed in the same war that had shaped Draven's own life so completely. "Why would anyone still care about a bloodline that's been extinct for 30 years?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Because bloodlines carry claims," Draven said. "Land claims, territorial rights, alliances that were never formally dissolved, simply abandoned when everyone believed the last heir had died." If you are truly the last surviving member of House Sable, you would hold a legitimate claim to territories currently controlled by packs, who have spent 30 years building their power on the assumption that no one would ever come to challenge it. So someone wants me dead, Alara said slowly. To protect a claim I didn't even know existed until this very moment. It would seem so, Draven said grimly, which means last night's attack was never truly about the other pups at all. They were caught in the danger simply because they shared a room with you. The true target, all along, was you. The weight of that realization settled over Alara with dizzying force. She thought of Fen, of the other 5 pups who had come to depend on her so completely, and felt a fresh wave of horror at how close they had all come to paying the price for a bloodline she had not even known she carried. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Draven was silent for a long moment, his expression carrying the particular weight of a man calculating consequences that extended far beyond the immediate present. "Now," he said finally, "we determine who else knows the truth of your bloodline, and we ensure that whoever sent that attacker last night understands clearly that any further attempt against you will be met with the full force of everything this pack commands. And if my bloodline truly does hold a claim to contested territory," Alara asked, "what does that make me, in the eyes of your pack and your council?" Draven met her gaze steadily, something fierce and unwavering in his expression that left no room for doubt regarding his answer. "It makes you someone whose safety I will not compromise on, regardless of what political complications it creates. It makes you someone I should have protected far more carefully from the very beginning, rather than allowing careless words spoken in a council chamber to cause you the kind of pain I saw in your eyes that evening." Ilara's breath caught at the raw honesty in his tone, so different from the careful, controlled king she had grown accustomed to over recent weeks. "Draven," she said softly, using his given name for the first time since she had known him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," he said, rising from his chair to kneel beside her bed, taking her hand carefully in both of his, "that I have spent weeks telling myself, and everyone around me, that my visits to that nursery meant nothing beyond simple duty. That was a lie, Alara, and I have known it was a lie since the very first night I found you asleep on that floor, buried beneath 6 grieving pups who trusted you more completely than they trusted anyone else in this entire fortress. My wolf recognized something in you that night that I have spent every day since trying to convince myself was not real, because acknowledging it meant facing consequences I was not yet ready to accept. And now?" Alara asked, her heart pounding with a hope she barely dared to acknowledge. "Now," Draven said, "I have nearly lost you to an attack that exists entirely because of who you truly are, and I find that I can no longer pretend that your safety and your place in my life are matters of simple duty. They are not. They have not been for a very long time." Alara felt tears slip free despite her best efforts to contain them, though these tears carried none of the sorrow of the ones she had shed weeks earlier in the privacy of her own quarters. "I heard what you told your council," she said softly. "I know how complicated this could become, especially now, with everything you've just told me about my bloodline." "It will be complicated," Draven agreed. "Rorik will have opinions, and other members of the council besides, once the truth of your heritage becomes known. There will be those who see opportunity in your bloodline, and those who see only threat. Navigating that will require patience and careful strategy from both of us." "But?" Ilara prompted, sensing the word hanging unspoken in the space between them. "But I am done pretending that patience and careful strategy require me to deny what is true," Draven said. "Whatever complications arise, I intend to face them honestly, beginning now, with you." The moment held a fragile, tentative kind of hope, the first honest acknowledgement either of them had allowed themselves since that very first night in the nursery. But even as Alara allowed herself to feel the warmth of that hope, a small, cautious part of her mind remained wary, aware that revelations of this magnitude rarely settled quietly, and that whatever peace they found in this private room would soon be tested by forces far beyond their control. She was right to be wary, because even as they sat together in that quiet chamber, finally speaking honestly to one another after weeks of careful denial, word of the previous night's attack and the identity of its intended target was already beginning to spread through the fortress, carried by whispers that would reach Rorik's ears before the day was through, setting in motion a chain of events that neither Alara nor Draven could yet fully anticipate. Rorik learned the truth by mid-afternoon, and he wasted no time acting on it. He had always possessed a talent for gathering information quickly and quietly, a skill that had served the pack well during negotiations, and less well during moments when his own ambitions required careful concealment. By the time a servant whispered word of the birthmark discovered on the nursery caretaker's shoulder, word that had traveled through the fortress with the particular speed reserved for secrets too dangerous to stay contained, Rorik had already begun calculating how such a revelation might be turned to his advantage. A living heir of House Sable was not merely a political inconvenience. Depending on how the surviving territorial claims were interpreted under the old treaties, she represented a legitimate challenge to the authority several packs, including certain factions within Blackthorn's own council, had built over the past 3 decades. If Alara's claim were ever formally recognized, and worse, if she were to become bound to Draven through mating, the combined authority of Blackthorn and a restored Sable claim could reshape the entire balance of power across the northern territories. Rorik did not intend to allow that to happen. He moved carefully, understanding that direct action against Alara while she remained under Draven's personal protection would be both foolish and dangerous. Instead, he began quietly reaching out to contacts within the same faction responsible for the previous night's attack, offering information they had clearly already suspected but had not yet confirmed, in exchange for assurances regarding his own position should their efforts to eliminate the Sable threat finally succeed. It was a betrayal of the worst kind, dressed carefully in the language of pragmatic necessity, and Rorik told himself, as he had told himself many times before regarding decisions of questionable loyalty, that he acted only in the best interests of the pack's long-term stability, regardless of the personal cost to individuals who simply happened to stand in the way of that stability. Alara, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the machinations unfolding around her, occupied instead with reuniting with the 6 pups who had been so thoroughly frightened by the previous night's events. She spent the following days recovering under Draven's careful watch, splitting her time between rest and gradually resuming her duties in the nursery, now guarded around the clock by soldiers whose presence made the pups understandably nervous at first, though they adjusted quickly enough once they understood the guards meant only to protect, not to threaten. Draven, for his part, remained close throughout those days, his earlier careful distance replaced entirely by an open, protective attention that left little doubt, to anyone paying attention, regarding the true nature of his feelings. He did not yet make any formal announcement to his council, understanding the political complexity such a declaration would unleash, but he no longer bothered concealing his visits to the nursery, no longer offered careful denials when questioned about his growing closeness to its caretaker. It was this openness, this apparent confidence in a future neither of them had yet fully secured, that made what followed all the more devastating when it finally arrived. The confrontation came nearly a week after the attack, during a council meeting that Draven had been required to attend without Alara's knowledge, a meeting during which Rorik, having laid his groundwork carefully over the preceding days, finally revealed his hand. The council has learned of certain developments regarding the nursery caretaker's true identity, Rorik announced, his tone carrying none of the reluctance one might expect from a man delivering unwelcome news, but rather the calculated satisfaction of someone who believed he held every advantage in the exchange to come. A birthmark identifying her as a potential heir of House Sable. This changes matters considerably, cousin, and not in ways that favor a hasty, sentimental attachment. Draven's jaw tightened, aware of exactly where this conversation was heading. The identity of her bloodline does not change my regard for her, he said carefully. Perhaps not, Rorik said, but it changes everything, regarding the political calculations surrounding any potential mating between you. If her claim to the Sable territories is recognized, formally binding yourself to her would create immediate and serious tension, with every pack currently holding portions of that contested land. We would be inviting war on multiple fronts, cousin, at precisely the moment when our defenses remain stretched thin from the recent attacks. And if I set aside political calculation entirely? Draven asked, his voice dangerously quiet. If I choose to claim her regardless of the complications it creates. Then you risk everything this pack has built over the past 6 years, Rorik said flatly. Not for strategic gain, but for sentiment. I would ask you to consider, cousin, whether the woman herself would wish to be the cause of such devastating conflict, were she given the choice. The words landed with calculated precision, striking at exactly the doubt Draven had not yet fully resolved within himself, and though he wanted desperately to dismiss Rorik's concerns as nothing more than jealous manipulation, the practical weight of the argument settled uncomfortably in his chest regardless. He did not give Rorik a definitive answer that day, choosing instead to end the meeting with careful ambiguity, promising further consideration before any formal decisions were announced. It was, he told himself, simply prudent caution, the same careful strategic thinking that had guided every successful decision of his reign thus far. But Alara, once again, learned of the council's discussion through channels beyond Draven's control, this time from Hannah, the kitchen maid, who had first alerted her to rumors months earlier, and who now delivered this fresh piece of gossip with evident concern rather than idle curiosity. "They're saying the Alpha King hesitated," Hannah said carefully, watching Alara's face for reaction as she spoke, "that when his cousin raised concerns about the complications your bloodline might create, he didn't argue against them. Didn't defend you outright, the way everyone expected he might." Alara felt something cold settle into her stomach, an echo of the same painful betrayal she had felt weeks earlier, standing outside the council chamber listening to Draven deny any attachment between them. She told herself this time that there must be a reasonable explanation, that political hesitation did not necessarily reflect personal feeling, that she owed Draven the chance to explain himself before drawing conclusions from second-hand gossip. But when she raised the matter with him that evening, watching his expression carefully as she asked directly whether the rumors held any truth, his hesitation before answering told her everything she feared to know. "It's complicated," Draven said finally, unable to offer the immediate, unwavering reassurance she had hoped for. "Rorik raises legitimate concerns about the political consequences of formally claiming you, given the contested nature of your bloodline's territorial claims. I need time to consider how best to navigate those complications, without endangering the stability of this pack." "Time," Alara repeated quietly, and something in her voice made Draven's chest tighten with immediate regret, though the words were already spoken and could not be recalled. "You need time to consider whether claiming me is worth the political cost." "That isn't what I meant," Draven said quickly, but the damage had already settled between them, an echo of the same pattern that had wounded her once before, the same careful distance rising up whenever political necessity pressed against personal truth. "Isn't it?" Alara said, and this time there was no anger in her voice, only a tired, resigned sadness that felt far worse than any accusation could have. "I understand the position you're in, Draven. I understand the weight of everything you carry as king. But I cannot keep living in the space between your private affection and your public hesitation, waiting to discover, each time your council raises concerns, whether I am worth defending or simply worth reconsidering." "Alara, please. I need to think," she said softly, gathering her composure with visible effort. "I need to understand what I actually am to you, beyond a complication your council would prefer you resolve quietly." She left him standing alone in the nursery that evening, and though he called after her, though he followed as far as the corridor before stopping himself, uncertain whether pursuit would help or worsen an already painful situation, he did not manage to find the right words in time to stop her from walking away. It was in the days that followed, as the distance between them grew rather than narrowed, that Alara made the decision that would change everything. She had spent her entire life being temporary, in the lives of others, a caretaker, given responsibility, precisely because no one else wanted the burden, a nameless orphan, whose presence, however valued in private moments, could always be dismissed or reconsidered when circumstances demanded it. She would not, she decided, spend the rest of her life waiting to discover whether she was worth the political cost of being chosen openly. She gathered the 6 pups quietly one evening, explaining as gently as she could that they would be traveling somewhere new, somewhere she believed would be safer for all of them, until the danger surrounding her bloodline could be properly resolved. The pups, sensing her seriousness despite their confusion, gathered close around her without protest, their trust in her remaining absolute, even as she prepared to leave behind the only home most of them had ever known. She left before dawn, taking only what supplies she could carry discreetly, leading 6 small, trusting shadows out through a service gate she had learned about during her years of quiet, overlooked service, to a pack that had never fully claimed her as one of its own. She left no note explaining her departure. She was not yet certain, in her own heart, whether she intended this separation to be permanent or simply necessary space to think clearly, away from the pull of feelings she could no longer trust, to be reciprocated with the openness she needed. She did not yet know that Rorik, having learned of Alara's presumed departure through his own network of informants, had already begun setting a far more dangerous plan into motion, one that would ensure the threat of a restored Sable claim was permanently eliminated before Draven ever had the chance to reconsider his hesitation. And she did not yet know that Draven, discovering her absence at dawn, would abandon every careful political calculation he had spent days agonizing over, choosing instead, without a single moment of further hesitation, to follow her into whatever danger awaited beyond the safety of Blackthorn's walls. Draven found the empty nursery just after sunrise, and the sight of 6 small, empty beds hit him with a force that nearly buckled his knees. He had spent the previous night lying awake, replaying every careful, cautious word he had offered Alara, recognizing far too late how thoroughly he had failed her in the exact moment she needed unwavering certainty rather than measured political calculation. He had resolved, as dawn approached, to find her that very morning, to finally say aloud every truth he had spent weeks avoiding, regardless of what consequences his counsel might raise against it. He arrived too late. The guards stationed near the nursery had noticed nothing unusual, assuming Alara's early departure with the pups to be nothing more than a routine outing, unaware that she had slipped past them with deliberate care, taking the quieter service passages that avoided the fortress's main points of observation. By the time Draven pieced together what had happened, several hours had already passed, hours during which Alara and the 6 pups could have traveled a considerable distance from the safety of Blackthorn's walls. His wolf surged forward with a ferocity he had not felt in years, instinct and grief and fury, combining into something that left no room for careful, measured thought. He gathered a small group of his most trusted trackers within minutes, refusing Rorik's suggestion that a larger, more official search party might be more appropriate, sensing without yet being able to prove it, that his cousin's concern carried less sincerity than it appeared to. "She cannot have gone far," Draven said grimly, studying the faint tracks leading away from the service gate, tracks that told a story of a woman moving quickly but carefully, mindful of the small pups following close behind her. Find her trail, now. They tracked her for the better part of the day, following a path that led steadily westward, away from Blackthorn territory and toward the wilder, less populated borderlands that separated their pack's holdings from the contested territories once ruled by House Sable. Draven recognized, with growing dread, exactly where Alara's instincts had led her, whether consciously or not, toward the very lands her bloodline held claim to, lands that remained dangerously unstable and largely unprotected by any established pack authority. It was nearly dusk when they finally caught sight of her, resting with the pups near a small stream at the edge of a dense forest. The children gathered close around her as she prepared a simple meal from the meager supplies she had carried. Draven's relief at finding her safe was immediate and overwhelming, though it lasted only a moment before a new and far more immediate danger revealed itself. Movement flickered at the tree line beyond the small clearing where Alara sat, shapes emerging with the coordinated precision of soldiers rather than wild animals, and Draven recognized, with a cold jolt of understanding, the same faction responsible for the earlier attack on the nursery, now closing in around Alara and the pups with clear and deadly intent. "Alara!" he called out, breaking into a full run as the first of the attackers emerged fully into the clearing. She spun toward his voice, relief and fear warring across her features, as she immediately gathered the pups behind her, positioning herself between them and the approaching danger, with the same fierce protective instinct she had shown during the nursery attack weeks earlier. "Draven?" she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "There are more of them, coming from the east as well." He saw it then, a second group, emerging from the opposite direction, and understood immediately that this was no simple ambush, but a carefully coordinated assault, one that had likely been planned for days, waiting only for Alara to leave the protection of Blackthorn's walls before finally executing its purpose. What followed was chaos, controlled by instinct and desperate necessity rather than careful strategy. Draven's trackers engaged the attackers approaching from the east, buying precious time as Draven himself pushed through toward Alara and the pups, determined to reach them before the closer group could close the remaining distance. Alara did not wait passively for rescue. She had learned, during the nursery attack, that survival often depended on immediate action rather than hope for outside intervention, and she gathered the pups quickly, directing the two oldest to lead their younger siblings toward a rocky outcropping nearby that offered at least partial shelter from direct assault, while she herself remained positioned to delay the approaching attackers for as long as necessary. "Get behind the rocks," she instructed the pups firmly, watching them scramble toward safety with the same trust they had always shown her, even now, even in the midst of terrifying danger. "Stay hidden, no matter what happens." She turned back toward the approaching attackers, just as Draven finally broke through the tree line, his expression carrying a fury that promised swift and thorough consequence for anyone who dared threaten what he had traveled so desperately to protect. Together they fought with a coordination that surprised even themselves, each instinctively understanding the other's movements, each covering vulnerabilities the other could not defend alone. Alara, though untrained in formal combat, fought with the same fierce protective determination she had shown weeks earlier, wielding a fallen branch with enough force and precision to keep her attackers at bay, while Draven dealt with the more serious threats bearing down on their position. It was not an easy victory. Draven took a serious wound across his forearm, defending against an attacker who nearly succeeded in reaching the rocky outcropping where the pups sheltered, and Alara herself sustained several painful bruises fending off an assailant who underestimated her determination, based on nothing more than her smaller size and lack of formal training. But gradually, as Draven's trackers finished dealing with the eastern group and moved to reinforce the main confrontation, the tide of the battle shifted decisively in their favor. The final attacker, recognizing the hopelessness of continuing the assault, attempted to flee into the surrounding forest, only to be intercepted and subdued by two of Draven's most experienced trackers before he could escape into the deepening dusk. In the sudden, exhausted quiet that followed, Alara sank to her knees beside the rocky outcropping, calling softly for the pups, who emerged one by one, frightened but unharmed, immediately crowding around her with small, trembling bodies, seeking the same reassurance she had always provided them. Draven crossed the clearing to kneel beside her, his own injuries forgotten entirely in the face of his desperate need to confirm she remained unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, hands hovering over her carefully, checking for injuries with the same frantic concern he had shown during the earlier attack. "Only bruises," Alara assured him, though her voice shook with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "The pups are safe, that's what matters." "You are what matters," Draven said fiercely, and something in his tone left no room for doubt or careful political hesitation. "I have been a fool, Alara. A careful, calculating fool who allowed fear of complication to overshadow the one truth that should have guided every decision I made since the night I found you asleep in that nursery. I love you, not despite the complications your bloodline creates, and not because of any political advantage your claim might offer. I love you because you are the bravest, most fiercely protective person I have ever known, and I nearly lost you today, because I failed to say these words clearly enough, soon enough, to keep you from ever doubting where you stood in my heart." Alara's breath caught, tears slipping free despite the exhaustion weighing heavily upon her. "Draven, I am not asking you to return to Blackthorn as my caretaker, or as a political complication to be carefully managed," Draven continued, taking her hands in his, despite the blood and dirt covering them both from the fight just past. "I am asking you to return as my equal. As my mate, should you have me, regardless of what challenges that choice creates with my council, or with any pack that believes it has more claim to authority than the truth of what stands between us." "And Rorik?" Alara asked softly. "The council's concerns about political stability, about the war such a claim might invite?" "Rorik," Draven said grimly, "will answer for whatever role he played in today's attack, because I have little doubt now that his warnings to the council, and this coordinated assault, are connected far more directly than simple coincidence would suggest. As for stability, I have spent 6 years building strength through strategy and careful calculation. I am done believing that strength requires abandoning the one truth that has never once wavered since I first found you sleeping beneath a pile of grieving pups who trusted you more completely than anyone else in my entire kingdom." Alara studied his face for a long moment, searching for any remaining trace of hesitation, any careful political calculation lurking beneath his words. She found none. Only the same raw, unguarded honesty she had glimpsed briefly in the healing chamber days earlier, now offered fully and without reservation. "Then yes," she said softly, allowing herself, finally, to embrace the hope she had spent so long trying to suppress. "I choose you too, Draven, not as your caretaker, and not as a political complication, as your equal, exactly as you've asked." The pups, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere around them despite their young age, pressed close around the two adults with soft, contented sounds, as though understanding, in their own instinctive way, that whatever separated the family they had come to depend on had finally, at long last, been resolved. But even as relief and hope settled over the small clearing, Draven knew that returning to Blackthorn would require confronting Rorik directly, exposing whatever betrayal lay behind the coordinated attacks that had twice now threatened everything he had come to hold most dear, and ensuring, through whatever means necessary, that Alara's claim to her true heritage would finally be recognized openly, rather than hidden away out of fear for the complications it might create. The journey back to the fortress, made slowly to accommodate their injuries, and the pup's exhaustion, gave both of them time to prepare for the confrontation that awaited, a confrontation that would determine not only the future of their relationship, but the very stability of the pack Draven had spent his entire adult life protecting. They arrived back at Blackthorn's gates 2 days later, weary and travel-worn, but united in a resolve that neither political pressure nor lingering danger would easily shake. Draven had sent word ahead through his fastest tracker, ensuring that his full council would be assembled by the time they reached the fortress, understanding that whatever confrontation awaited Rorik needed to happen swiftly, publicly, and with undeniable evidence to support it. That evidence arrived in the form of the attacker captured during the clearing battle, a man who, faced with the certainty of severe consequence and offered the possibility of leniency in exchange for full cooperation, confirmed everything Draven had already begun to suspect. Rorik had indeed provided information regarding Alara's bloodline and her presumed departure from the fortress, information that had allowed the coordinated attack to be planned and executed with precise, devastating timing. The council chamber fell into stunned silence when Draven presented this evidence before the full assembly, Rorik's carefully composed expression cracking visibly under the weight of accusations he could no longer deflect through clever rhetoric alone. "You would believe the confession of a captured enemy over the loyalty of your own cousin," Rorik said, though his voice lacked its usual confident authority, betraying the desperation of a man who understood, finally, that his careful maneuvering had reached its limit. "I would believe evidence, Rorik," Draven said coldly, "corroborated by testimony, timing, and motive that all point in the same unmistakable direction. You feared what a restored Sable claim might mean for your own influence within this council, and you were willing to see innocent children endangered, and the woman I love killed, to protect that influence." The council members present, many of whom had genuinely respected Rorik's counsel over the years, now regarded him with expressions ranging from disbelief to cold contempt. Whatever standing he had built within Blackthorn's hierarchy crumbled entirely in that single damning moment, and Draven, exercising the full authority of his position, ordered his cousin's immediate removal from the council and confinement, pending further judgment regarding the full extent of his betrayal. With that matter resolved, Draven turned to address the remaining, equally significant purpose of the assembly. "I stand before this council today," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent chamber, "to formally recognize Alara, of House Sable, as the legitimate heir to territories and claims long considered extinguished. More than that, I stand here to announce my intention to claim her as my mate and as Luna Queen of this pack, regardless of whatever political complications that recognition might create with neighboring territories." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council, though none carried the hostile edge that Rorik's earlier manipulations had once stirred. Whatever doubts remained among the pack's leadership had been thoroughly undermined by the revelation of Rorik's betrayal, and many among them recognized, watching Alara stand beside their king with quiet, unwavering dignity, despite everything she had endured, that whatever political complications her claim might create, her character had already proven itself worthy of the position she was about to assume. "The territorial claims of House Sable," Draven continued, "combined with the strength and stability of Blackthorn, offer this pack an opportunity, rather than a threat, should we choose to pursue it wisely. Rather than inviting conflict with neighboring packs currently holding contested lands, I propose we approach this transition through careful negotiation, offering fair terms that recognize both historical claims and present realities. War benefits no one. Stability, built on legitimate authority and mutual respect, benefits everyone. The council, freed from Rorik's manipulative influence and faced with a king who spoke with clear, confident authority rather than uncertain hesitation, offered their support with far greater unity than Draven had anticipated. Whatever challenges remained in formally establishing Alara's claim and negotiating the complex territorial questions it raised would require considerable time and careful diplomacy, but the immediate crisis, both political and personal, had finally reached resolution. The formal mating ceremony took place several weeks later, once Alara's injuries had fully healed, and the initial diplomatic groundwork with neighboring territories had been carefully laid. It was, by the standards of most royal ceremonies, a relatively modest affair, held in the same fortress courtyard where Draven had once watched soldiers train for a war he hoped, with Alara's claim now properly recognized, might finally be avoided entirely through patient negotiation rather than continued conflict. The 6 pups, dressed in small formal robes that clearly delighted them far less than their usual playclothes, sat in the front row of assembled witnesses, watching with wide, solemn eyes, as Draven and Alara exchanged the traditional vows that would bind them together, not merely as mates, but as co-rulers of a pack, whose future now included both Blackthorn's established strength and the restored legitimacy of House Sable's ancient claims. Fen, no longer the trembling, silent pup who had refused to shift in the aftermath of his parents' death, stood proudly beside the ceremonial altar, having insisted, with the particular determined stubbornness of small children who have decided something matters greatly to them, that he be allowed to carry the ceremonial rings to the altar himself, a duty he performed with careful, solemn concentration that drew fond smiles from every witness present. When the ceremony concluded, and Draven finally drew Alara into an embrace that sealed their union before the full assembly of the Blackthorn pack, the 6 pups broke from their formal seating with characteristic enthusiasm, rushing forward to press themselves against their new parents' legs, with the same unrestrained joy they had once reserved only for Alara alone. "Does this mean?" Fen asked, tilting his head up toward Draven, with the particular seriousness only small children could manage during otherwise joyful occasions, "that you're really our father now, not just someone who visits?" Draven knelt down to meet the boy's eyes directly, his expression carrying none of the careful political distance that had once defined his interactions with everyone beyond his closest advisors. "Yes," he said simply. "I am your father now, Fen. All 6 of you. Officially, and for as long as I live." The boy's answering smile, wide and unguarded and utterly without the shadow of grief that had once defined his every expression, struck both Draven and Alara with a force that left neither of them entirely composed. Tears of pure happiness slipping free as they gathered all 6 children into a shared embrace that drew warm, approving laughter from the assembled crowd. Life within Blackthorn's fortress settled, in the months that followed, into a rhythm neither Draven nor Alara had ever truly believed possible for themselves. The nursery, once a place of quiet, unacknowledged sacrifice, transformed gradually into the beating heart of the entire fortress, filled now not only with the 6 children who had first brought Alara and Draven together, but eventually with additional orphaned pups from across the growing alliance between Blackthorn and the restored Sable territories, all of them welcomed with the same unconditional warmth that had once saved 6 grieving children from a grief too heavy for them to carry alone. Rorik's fate, decided eventually through careful deliberation rather than hasty vengeance, resulted in permanent exile from Blackthorn territory, a consequence Draven considered more than fair, given the severity of his betrayal, though he could not entirely suppress a lingering sadness for the cousin he had once trusted so completely, now lost to ambition that had cost him everything he might otherwise have retained. The territorial negotiations regarding House Sable's restored claims proceeded, as Draven had hoped, through patient diplomacy rather than renewed conflict, the combined strength and legitimacy of Blackthorn and Sable proving persuasive enough to convince most neighboring packs that cooperation offered far greater benefit than continued dispute over contested lands. It was not a perfect peace, and challenges remained that would require years of careful attention to fully resolve. but it represented a future built on strength rather than fear. Exactly the kind of stability Draven had always hoped to achieve, though he had never imagined achieving it alongside a partner whose own quiet strength matched, and, in many ways, exceeded his own. Late one evening, nearly a year after that first fateful night when Draven had discovered Elara asleep beneath a pile of grieving pups, he found himself once again standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching a scene remarkably similar to the one that had first captured his heart so completely. Elara sat on the floor near the center of the room, having fallen asleep while reading a story to the youngest of their growing collection of children, and around her, curled close and utterly content, lay not 6 pups now, but 9, each one having found in her the same unwavering safety and warmth that had first drawn Fen and his siblings to her side so many months earlier. Draven crossed the room quietly, settling himself onto the floor beside her without waking her, allowing 2 of the smallest pups to shift instinctively to make room for him against her side. He watched the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing, the soft, unguarded expression on her sleeping face, and felt, once again, the same quiet, overwhelming gratitude that had first taken root in his chest on that long-ago night, now grown into something far deeper and more permanent than he had ever believed himself capable of feeling. Elara stirred slightly, blinking awake to find him beside her, and smiled with the particular warmth she reserved only for him, a warmth built not on politics or bloodlines or careful strategic calculation, but on the simple, unshakable truth that they had chosen each other, fully and without reservation, exactly as they were. "Found asleep in the nursery again," she murmured softly, glancing around at the pile of contented children surrounding them both. "Seems to be becoming something of a tradition for this family." "A tradition I intend to continue for the rest of my life," Draven said, drawing her gently against his shoulder, careful not to disturb the sleeping children curled around them. Outside the nursery windows, the moon hung full and bright over Blackthorn's territory, casting its silver light across a fortress that had finally, after years of conflict and careful guarded distance, found the kind of peace that came not from strength alone, but from the courage to choose love over fear, and family over the careful, isolating burden of standing entirely alone. And in that quiet nursery, surrounded by children who had once been orphaned and afraid, now safe and thriving, beneath the shared protection of a king and queen who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, that peace felt, for the first time in either of their lives, entirely and permanently theirs to keep.